What is up, guys? This is Simon from Card Gaming, and today is going to be a Things to Remember video about the Branded Despia deck. This is going to be similar to the video that I made for Sword Soul a couple months ago, just kind of some tips and tricks and some important interactions to know to make sure that either you're not missing out on ways to win the game, or that you're not letting illegal plays happen to you if you play against Branded. Before I go into that, I wanted to talk about some frequently asked questions I got on the last two videos. I'm going to preface all this by saying that these are all my opinions. I've been wrong in the past, and so I could be wrong about these as well, but I'm going to answer these to the best of my ability. Number one is this deck going to be good? Which I think is a very, very frequently asked question, and my response to that is I think it is going to be good, potentially the best deck. If not immediately, then certainly after a ban list, I think it's going to be the best deck. And I think you can look at the success of a deck like Adventurer Prank Kid at YCS Charlotte, which took up, I think, 10 of the spots in top 32. This deck is very similar to that in a lot of ways, where you have these one-card combos that just put out a ton of advantage. The difference is, I think, that this deck is a bit more fragile compared to Prank, and Prank has more starters, but this deck has a lot more return off of its actual combo, off of Branded Fusion Resolving, and you just get a lot more follow-up and a lot more push, and it's harder to interact with. And I also think this deck is a very good matchup into Pranked, because Battle Butler is really not that relevant against this deck at all, and Mirrorjade's wipe effect is very strong against Pranked, which tries to swarm the field. So I think this deck is in a very good spot for the next meta, just pointing at the current meta trends and what is succeeding right now. And so I expect this deck to be very strong after release. The next question I get a lot is, do you play Adventure in this deck, or is Adventure the best way to play this deck? And I think it is. I think you can point to the OCG and look at just how dominant Adventure has been over there. It's dominant to an extent where you can't really expect it to be any other way here. Like in the format where they had 2 Right and 2 Enchantress, there was almost no pure Despia at all. It was almost exclusively Adventure. And here we have the Adventure engine at full power, for now at least, with 3-3, and we have DPE legal, which they didn't. And so Adventure being able to bridge into Verte and DPE is another advantage of that engine. And there's so many advantages besides just protecting your Branded Fusion from Ash. There's so many other things that make the Adventure engine strong. One of them, for example, is that if this deck is a prominent meta threat, which I think it will be, Mirrorjade's end phase nuke is an important thing to play around. If it dies, then you Raigeki your opponent's field. And the most reliable answer to this card in the entire game is Draco Back Bounce Effect. You just put it back in the extra deck and then it can't trigger. And it is the most reliable out to Mirrorjade. And that's a huge point in favor of Adventurer. Some other minor things are that these help you play around side cards. They help you play around D-Barrier by giving you an actual play. You can use Draco Back to remove threats, and then you have Griffin as a negate, and it gives you something you can do into D-Barrier. These out Floodgates, it outs Mystic Mine, it also outs cards like Rivalry of Warlords, because the token is a fairy and your Despias are also all fairies, so you actually don't get locked out by stuff like Rivalry. And more importantly, I think also the Adventure engine gives you a play into Super Poly as well. The pure deck pretty much only has dark monsters no matter what version you're playing, and so either you're going to be open to a Super Poly when you pass turn, or you're going to have one monster, and then they can still Super Poly you if they summon their own dark monster, which is very common in the mirror. If you have no monsters, you can't brand in red for Chimera, and then suddenly all your disruption is offline. Whereas if you play Adventurer cards, you will still have monsters through a Super Poly. You'll still have this branded in red into Chimera play through a Super Poly. So those are all, I think, benefits of the Adventurer package, and there's even more that I haven't discussed. But I think this engine is strong in many more ways than one. It's not just Called by the Grave. So that's my take on this engine. Following up into that is, do you play DPE in this deck, or is it optimal to play DPE in this deck? And my opinion again is yes, you probably should be playing this while we have it legal at 2 copies at least. Even if the pure deck doesn't really make Verte that often, because it can't really, I think this engine is still strong to just hard draw. You saw at YCS Charlotte that people who hard open Fusion Destiny were typically just massively ahead in the game. And there's even some combos I'll show later on in this video that cover stuff you can do with the DPE garnets that are actually pretty interesting and let you get DPE access without seeing Fusion Destiny. So I think this is worthwhile. I think the biggest drawback of DPE is that it's actually pretty bad in the mirror, from my testing at least. But I think this card is so good against everything that's not the mirror match that I think it's still worth playing. And then the last question is, do you play like other Albaz cards in this deck? Cards like the main deck Albion, the Shrouded Dragon, or Branded Lost, I think is a continuous spell. And many more that I didn't discuss in the last video, like Incredible Ecclesia is playable in this deck even, Springen's Kit. And all these cards I think are pretty cool. The decks I'm showing off are pretty based off the OCG theory, and basically what they've decided is the optimal combination of cards after about 2 to 3 formats of trying to optimize this deck. So those cards are typically not played in those lists, but we could see a lot of innovation in the TCG. We saw that with Sword Soul in the TCG, playing cards that the OCG never really played. So there could very well be some innovation here for us. For cards like Branded Lost, I think has a lot of potential. It's a really cool card going second. Cards like Albion the Shrouded Dragon, I think have a lot of potential. But for now, I'm going to be sticking to what the OCG has decided is the best way to play the deck, and we'll see how the deck evolves over time. But yeah, that's going to do it for the FAQ. Let's go right into the things to remember. Tip number 1 is to remember that most of your cards have more than one effect, and this seems very obvious, but it's really easy to forget in the middle of a game. Aluber has a graveyard effect where if your fusion monster is destroyed by battle or leaves the field because of an opponent's card effect, you can bring Aluber back and then summon it to the field and target an effect monster your opponent controls and then negate its effects for that turn. So it's kind of like Sky Striker Ace Rose. It's easy to forget, but it's a strong effect. Very, very important to note that you can only use one of these effects per turn, so you cannot summon and then search. This is going to be something that people will forget all the time, so do not let this happen to you, where they'll bring back Aluber and then try to search a Branded Spell or Trap, because that is not how that works. So be very aware of that. Tragedy has a very relevant effect where if it's in your grave, you can banish it and then reset a Branded Spell Trap. And again, you cannot use both of these in the same turn, so be very, very aware of this too. You cannot just dump Tragedy with Branded Fusion, search, and then reset a Branded Spell Trap, because that'd be very, very strong. But this is insane follow-up on later turns to just reset your spell traps if you ended up keeping this in grave instead of banishing it with Branded in red. And this is one of the more important ones to be aware of as well. Branded Opening has a really relevant effect where if a fusion monster you control would be destroyed by card effect, you can banish it from your grave instead. This is extremely, extremely important against DPE, against Guardian Chimera, and against Mirrorjade's end phase Raigeki effect. These are all effects that come up all the time in the mirror. You need to be very aware of opening, because it can really turn the tide of the game and just leave you with monsters when your opponent expected them to die otherwise. And of course it's relevant against other decks as well that destroy stuff, which just happens all the time. And then Ad Libitum, this is a minor one that I mentioned in the OTK combo in the last video, but it has an effect on field where you can make your monsters gain attack equal to their own level times 100. This can be used to clutch out OTKs or to get over annoying boss monsters that you can't really beat over otherwise. This one definitely comes up probably the least of all of these secondary effects, but if you summon this with opening, then it can be relevant. One very notable use of Aluber's graveyard effect before I go on is that you can use it to kind of irritate your opponent when they have negates. So here my opponent has Baron and is going to destroy my Mirrorjade, and they're going to think that they can use this negation to stop the Raigeki effect in the end phase. But I'm going to use my Mirrorjade's effect as Chainlink 1 and then my Aluber's effect as Chainlink 2 because they both trigger off of the Mirrorjade dying. And now my opponent's Baron can't negate the Mirrorjade, and this Raigeki is going to happen in the end phase and going to wipe their whole board. So that is an extremely relevant example of why Aluber's Grave effect is actually important, so just be aware of this. This is going to be a real quick one about Despia and Tragedy. This is not just a generic floater, it has to be sent to grave or banished by a card effect in order to trigger. So Opening and Fateful Adventure will both trigger Tragedy because these both discard for effect, but Rebellion will not because this is a cost. This also doesn't trigger off of Link Summoned, or if you destroy this by battle. Stuff like that will not trigger Tragedy Search, except for the very niche scenario where they have a floodgate like Dimension Shifter or Shen applying, and it will banish Tragedy when it leaves the field. So here, if I link off Tragedy for Relinquished Anima, this will actually trigger Tragedy in a new chain. Very, very specific, but worth knowing. Next up are 2 tips about Ad Lib. This card only triggers if it's fused from hand or field. So first of all, it doesn't trigger from deck. So that's going to be an important one. You cannot just send it from deck with Branded Fusion and then trigger Ad Lib Revive because it says it has to be sent from hand or field. So most of the time you're going to be using Branded in red to trigger this card. It also doesn't trigger off of other card effects that send it to grave or banish it. So Foolish Burial obviously doesn't work for multiple reasons, but even DD Crow, if they banish it from grave, I've seen people concerned that this will trigger Ad Lib. That's not the case. It has to be fused specifically from hand or field. Ad Lib versus Ghost Belle is another minor one that can come up. Ad Lib will target a card in the grave or banished, and then the question is whether you can chain Ghost Belle to it. You can only chain Belle if Ad Lib targets a monster in the graveyard, not a monster that's banished, because if it targets a monster that's banished, it's not a card effect that includes something that Belle lists. So this is similar to Ghost Belle versus Dragostapelia. There's already precedent for this. So if Ad Lib is targeting a banished monster, Belle cannot be responded. And so in that big chain link where you go Branded Red and then you fuse Tragedy, Ad Lib, and Mirrorjade, Ad Lib is typically chain link 3 targeting the banished Mirrorjade, and that is totally fine. You cannot respond with Belle to that, although you would typically build a Branded Red in the first place. And that actually goes into my next tip, which is that Branded Fusion and Branded in Red are both activate once per turn, not use once per turn. And that means that if the activation of these cards are negated, you can activate another copy in the same turn. This is most relevant for Branded in Red versus Belle, because Belle negates activations. If you have 2 Branded in Red, you can just allow the first one, and then the second one will resolve perfectly fine. This is similar to when Tri-Brigade had multiple revolts to play around Ghost Belle. And then the last tip, and I think probably the most important tip in this entire video, is that Mirrorjade Dragostapelia effect is turned off if it is not fusion summoned. So if you fuse away Mirrorjade, Ad Lib, and whatever for your standard combo, and then you summon Mirrorjade back from banished with Ad Lib effect, this is no longer a fusion summon card, and this Dragostapelia effect is turned off. People are going to miss this all the time early on in the format, so be really, really aware of this, and just make sure that people aren't triggering this when they aren't supposed to. Let's talk about 2 extra deck cards. The first is going to be Guardian Chimera. This is a crucial part of the Branded in Red combo. It needs to be fused using monsters from only your hand and field with at least 1 from each. So you can't do 3 from hand or 3 from field. It has to be 1 and 2 or 2 and 1. You have to destroy cards equal to the cards you use as material from the field. So your opponent has to control at least that number of cards. So if you fuse with 2 from field, your opponent has to control 2 or more cards for you to be able to legally activate this effect in the first place. So that's important to know, first of all. There's a rare scenario where when you activate Chimera, let's say you fuse 2 from field and you activate this effect, and then they chain some effect like DPE, and when the chain resolves, they don't have 2 cards for Chimera to destroy in resolution. If that's the case, you still draw 1, but you wouldn't destroy anything, because you have to destroy exactly 2. Pretty straightforward. This card can be ashed because it draws cards. That's minor, but also important to remember in the case where Chimera is the last thing on the chain. And then some niche things for variants of this deck. If you play the Frightfur package, you will be playing Polymerization. If this is in your graveyard, then Chimera becomes untargetable. This is written on the card, but it's easy to forget because it's not that common that it comes up. And then finally for Chimera, if you've played Pot of Prosperity in the same turn, you can't draw any cards, and because Chimera has to draw a card to use this effect, you can't activate Chimera if you summon this on your own turn. This is usually when you're trying to break a board, going second for example, with Chimera, so be aware of this interaction. The other card I want to talk about is Predapine Dragostapelia. This card is a bit more complicated than people are giving it credit for. It's not just Imperm, it actually has 2 effects. So first it puts a Predator counter on your opponent's monster, and then it has a continuous effect where the monster will have its activated effects negated as long as they have a Predator counter. So there's a couple things to unpack here. Because it relies on the opponent's monster having a counter, and its own effect is continuous, if either Dragostapelia or the other monster are not face-up on the field when that other monster's effect resolves, it doesn't get negated. So you can play around this negation by removing either Dragostapelia itself or the monster with a counter on it. And then this also only negates activated effects. So this doesn't negate, like for example, continuous effects. This is relevant for Shen, for Empen, and for DPE attack boost. Or for DPE's attack change rather, because it'll lower the attack of all your monsters. So it's very common, for example, that you'll have a 2300 Dragostapelia against a 2500 DPE, and you won't be negating that effect because it doesn't activate. So all good things to know about Dragostapelia. Let's go to the next one. Next up are some ways you can play around some hand traps. One of the most obvious is Branded Opening. You can use this in the draw phase to play around Draw Unlock Bird, because you cannot draw unlock in the draw phase. So if I go Opening, discard Tragedy, summon Aluber, and then I trigger Tragedy and Aluber in the new chain, I can add a Branded in Red, and then Ad Lib, and then they can't draw me because this is all in the draw phase. Likewise, if I summon a Mirrorjade, I can use this banishing effect in the battle phase or in the end phase to play around cards like Effect Veiler and sometimes even Nibiru, because I can go like end phase first and threaten that, and then if they nib, I'll just chain my Mirrorjade to get the effect off for sure. Those are both relevant, and it's also worth noting that Albion plays around Droll and Lockbird because it can set the Branded Spell Trap directly from the deck in the end phase, and so it's not adding from deck to hand. So if you get Drolled in this deck, you can still do a lot because your Albion doesn't really care. Next are some important attack restrictions that will prevent you from attacking per game. I think these are really important to know as well. If you're playing against Branded, make sure that they aren't putting out more damage than they're supposed to. All of these cards have some kind of restriction that will prevent you from doing as much damage as you think you'd be able to. So opening summons in defense, so don't be summoning Aluber in attack. Lubellion has this restriction where if you try to fusion summon and this resolves, the rest of the turn, Lubellion cannot attack. So that will be a free 2500 damage that is not there for you. And then finally, the most important one is that Branded Red says that the monster you summon cannot attack directly this turn. So I think you're going to have a lot of games where people try to Branded Red in battle phase for a Chimera or something, and then they'll try to swing for a game with a Chimera. You cannot do that, so be very, very aware of this one if you're facing off against a branded player. Last off are some quick tips for other variants of the deck, including DPE Garnets and synergy you can have with that. So first of all, Branded Fusion, sending Edgem Chain. You cannot trigger Edgem Chain here, because this doesn't trigger when you send it from the deck to the graveyard. It's not just a generic floater. It has to be sent from the hand or field to the graveyard, so this doesn't work. So don't let people do this. If you open a DPE Garnet, so Celestial or Dasher, there's actually some pretty cute synergy. We can go Lubellion, sending the other Garnet, because they're both dark monsters. So instead of Tragedy, we're going to send Dasher here. And then Lubellion is going to discard the Celestial in our hand, and we're going to Fusion Summon. So we can actually Fusion Summon DPE directly here with Lubellion, because this is a generic Fusion Summon effect. We're going to put back Celestial and Dasher and then bring out DPE. And this is pretty cool. And this can come up in some game states where you really prioritize this DPE as soon as possible in this game state and you didn't open Fusion Destiny. So definitely this is a cool one to know. This is not strictly optimal in most cases. What's actually better in my opinion is you keep your Destiny heroes in the grave, and you put back your Albaz and your Lubellion, and you just summon Mirrorjade as normal. And this will set up your Pot of Greed for turn 3, and I think this is just really, really good. We can go Mirrorjade, Standard Search, whatever, dump Albion, add Branded Fusion, and then our turn 3 we're going to draw 2 with Celestial, and these are both banished. Now the cool thing about this is that let's say we activate Branded Fusion, we bring out another Lubellion, and then this card will discard, and we can Fusion Summon again, so we can put back our Destiny Hero Garnets, and bring out DPE this way on turn 3. And I think this is really, really strong because you've got your standard setup plus 2 cards from Celestial, plus you have DPE in rotation without ever seeing Fusion Destiny. And then finally, a really minor thing that I don't think is really optimal, but is definitely an option. Let's say you've summoned DPE previously in the duel, and they outed it, and you've already resolved your Celestial. If you play 2 DPE, you can actually put back your Garnets and summon a second DPE from the extra here. So this is, I think, a pretty cool thing you can do. If you've gotten rid of the first one somehow and you've managed to resolve your Destiny heroes and this is a long grind game, if you can get to a Lubellion, you can bring out a second one by putting back your Garnets. And I think that is neat. And that's going to really do it for this video. Next up, I want to do some commentary. I think I'm going to do the OCG match first from Next Play. Look out for that one. Maybe this week, potentially next week. There's a regional I want to attend this weekend, so I might be prepping for that. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe, check out our sponsors, check out our card market link in the description, and our link to Ultimate Guard. Until then, I will see you in the next one. Peace.